Warm welcome to Dr. Gleb Sikorsky.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. And so I'm really glad to see so many hands go up for folks who want to help analytically minded clients. It's a difficult issue, as a number of us here understand. How do you deal with people who are different from you, who don't have that focus on intuition, focus on building trust, focus on building connection? And there are so many people like that. I mean, Mark, as he knows, works with engineers, but there are also bankers, lawyers, CFOs, people who are rated as thinking or judgment on the Myers-Briggs scale. So lots of people like that out there. And this presentation will help you learn how to engage with these folks, how to actually use evidence-based strategies to connect with them effectively in a way that gets them what they want and helps you be the best coach for them. By doing that, you will be confident that you can provide them with the kind of coaching support that they need, and it will help you sign them up as clients because you can be ethically honest with them about the kind of work that you do. So that's what this presentation is about. Now, it's based on a 12 CCE course approved by ICF called Coaching the Analytical Mind, which is available online. So this is all certified by the ICF, and this is just a small 1.25 unit aspect of it that I'm presenting here. I'm just letting you know there's a lot more content that I'm not covering very small aspect of things here. After this presentation, what I want you to work away with is the ability to be confident and to sleep soundly at night that you can serve your analytically minded clients. That's one of the goals. Another goal is to help you understand what exactly is going on in the minds of these analytically minded clients so that they don't surprise you. Because you'll often find yourself being surprised by how they're reacting to ways that you're interacting with them. And you'll be able to exceed the expectations of these analytically minded clients, both they themselves and if you're an internal coach, if you're working with an organization, as was mentioned before, for the organization. So these are all the goals of this presentation. Now, does that sound like something you want?
Yeah. Yes.
Come on, say it like you just signed your best client. There you go, good. So that's what the presentation is about. Now, when I come up and spoke here, for those of you who don't know too much about me, don't know much about my background, I'm guessing I know what some of you thought. Where's this guy from? I obviously have an accent, right? I obviously have an accent. Now, you might not have had this question asked of you, where are you from? You might have had it asked, but I get that asked of me all the time. And so that's a question I frequently get asked, and I tell people the truth, I'm from New York. Now, obviously, that's not what they want to hear because they want to know where I got my accent. Now, my parents came from a small country called Moldova in Eastern Europe when I was 10. And so that's it right there. It's a tiny country. It's most well known for being one of the least happy countries in the world. So I'm really happy that they left. Now, when we came, we settled down in New York City. I grew up in a really dirt poor environment. It was really quite bad when I was a kid. I didn't know that it was that bad, it was just my environment. But we lived in roach-infested apartments. When I turned on the lights, the roaches would scatter. So that's kind of an environment. I didn't know what it was like to have new clothing as a kid. I always wore hand-me-downs. And my parents couldn't afford a bus pass for me to go to school, so I walked to school each day. It was about 6 miles uphill in the snow, both ways. No, seriously, there were 2 hills. So that was the environment in which I grew up, and it was really hard. There were one of the things I remember is that my dad drove a bread truck. So for Italian food, for an Italian bakery. So at least we never went hungry. I always had bread that fell off the back of the truck. I still remember when the smell of fresh Italian sourdough. That really brings back memories of my dad coming home. So I still have that memory. And we had, when people throw out their furniture, we went foraging for this furniture to kind of get it back to the house. At least when we got it back to the house, we had help. You haven't lived until you've seen a couch carried up the stairs by 300 cockroaches. It was a really tough environment, but I didn't want to give up my accent. So there were many people who did. There were many people who wanted to Americanize themselves, who wanted to integrate into the country. I didn't want to do that. I really appreciated my cultural heritage. I didn't want to give up my accent, and so I kept my accent, unlike many people. Now, I found out later that was a pretty dumb decision, unfortunately, because of a phenomenon called accent discrimination. Americans tend to perceive those with foreign accents as much less trustworthy than those with American accents. In all sorts of cases, for almost all foreign accents, there's only one exception. Can you guess what that is?
British.
Excellent. We still have that cultural imperialism overlords dominating us. So we still have that aspect of things. That's the only accent that is not discriminated against. And this is part of a mental phenomenon known as the Horns effect and the halo effect. The Horns effect: when we don't like one aspect of someone, we won't like all of their other aspects, if that is important to us, like accent, your background. The halo effect, the opposite. When we like one aspect of someone, we like all of their other aspects. So accent discrimination is only one example of the halo and horns effect. That, of course, is something that deeply undermines us when we're dealing with people with other gender, color, race, sexuality, and so on. So it's responsible for a great deal of stereotypes that undermine us deeply. Come in, don't be shy. You're okay, yes, you're in the right room. Yes, there's a seat right here, there's seats back there. So this is a dangerous thing, and you'll be surprised by how many people it impacts. You might think that people who are professionally trained to address the halo and horns effect aren't impacted by it. Well, you'd be wrong. I was giving a presentation much like this one in actually May 2018 to the Human Resources Association of Central Ohio, their Diversity and Inclusion Conference, by the way. So it was a room of about 100 HR professionals. And I asked them, hey, at that time I was a professor at Ohio State, and as you know, professors at Ohio State are contractually obligated to root for the Buckeyes. So I said that, and I said, we at Ohio State, where I still was at the time, didn't like Michigan fans too much, as they made really poor life choices. And so I asked them, hey, how many of you would hire a Michigan fan? And you know what? 3 hands went up. 3 hands. And I kind of challenged them, saying, really? Three hands? And people didn't want to hire Michigan fans. Now I asked them, does being a Michigan fan have anything to do with work performance? And of course it doesn't have anything to do with work performance. But that's the kind of deep underlying bias, emotional bias that we have, the Horns effect toward Michigan fans. So that's an example of where you wouldn't think that the Horns effect impacts you, but it really deeply impacts you, even if you're deeply and thoroughly trained to address the Horns effect as HR professionals are. So right now, I want you to take a moment, by which I mean 30 seconds, and take a look at the handout that came with the book, and write down how in your coaching practice you might internalize the research on the halo and horns effect when you engage with your clients. So just take 30 seconds, write that down. How might you internalize that? How might you use it in your coaching practice? All right, I see most people are finishing writing. Good. Let's talk about the next topic. Feelings, emotions, something that we forget. It's hard for us to remember that analytically minded people are actually driven by these feelings and emotions like the halo and horns effect. which we don't realize, but they are, and we are as well. So, who is that? Spock. What's the relevance of Spock in emotions?
You taught us that it is better not to feel.
There you go. Yes, for Star Wars fans, which is far superior, Star Trek fans, which is far superior to Star Wars, by the way. Yes, so Spock is a prototypical analytically minded person who is perceived as not having strong feelings. But if you actually watch Star Trek, if you go into it more deeply, you'll see that he's actually really powerfully driven by emotions, and he makes really bad decisions because he's driven to do emotional things. Where he says, I don't understand why people are feeling this way, and he goes and does things based on feelings. So those of you who are Star Trek fans, you know what I'm talking about. And it's hard for us, for people who are more emotionally driven, to remember that. So I'm going to tell the story, Mark, about you and how I coached for Mark, or I consulted for Mark at Edison Welding Institute. And one of the things that Mark had trouble doing, and the other folks, the leadership at Edison Welding Institute had trouble doing, was figuring out how to motivate their engineers to do selling, to do marketing. So that was something really difficult, and they were speaking to the engineers in terms of branding, reputation for the company. And what I found after talking, after looking at the language that they used, was that they weren't connecting with the engineers emotionally. They weren't really motivating engineers where the engineers needed to be motivated. And I told this to Mark, and Mark asked me, what did you ask me, Mark?
How do I get through to them?
Yes, how do you get through? Do engineers have emotions?
Yes.
Yes. So Mark asked me, do engineers have emotions? And that's kind of a question where the nature of the question, the underlying nature of the question shows that just because engineers aren't showing their emotions on their face, just because analytically minded people aren't showing their emotions, just like Spock is not showing his emotions, doesn't mean that they don't have emotions or they're not driven by emotions. Research shows that we are all driven fundamentally by our emotions. About 80 to 90% of our actions and our thoughts are driven by feelings, by underlying emotions. We can go more into that in the Q&A. But that's something you need to realize, that all the analytically minded people you deal with are driven by emotions first and foremost, but the large majority of them don't realize it. Again, the large majority of them don't realize it. And that's crucial. They keep their emotions under wraps. They're not in touch with their emotions. And that means that they don't realize where these emotions are steering them astray. You as coaches, one of your primary goals is to help them realize where these emotions are steering them astray. And that's the ICF core competency of creating awareness. How do you create awareness? How do you do that for these analytically minded people who are suffering from their lack of emotional awareness, from their lack of emotional engagement? That's a key goal of when you work with analytically minded people. So I want you to, again, take 30 seconds and write in the handout about this question. How can you effectively create awareness in analytically minded people about the emotions that are driving them in ways that these analytically minded people aren't realizing, in ways that are really hurting them and the people around them? Just like Spock hurt many Star Trek missions that went astray. All right, I see that most people are finishing up, so let's go on to the next point. What's up with these emotions? Why are they driving us astray? What's going on there? The key is our evolutionary heritage. That's what we have to remember. That's where the emotions are coming from. That's why they're driving us astray. That's why we can't trust our gut intuitions in many cases, like in the halo and horns effect with accents. Our evolutionary heritage is adapted for the savanna environment. Our gut reactions, our intuitions are adapted for the savanna environment. That's the fight or flight response. You might have heard of that, the lizard brain. That's the tribalism. We are used emotionally with our gut reactions to living in a tribal environment, to living in small tribal groups, to trusting people who are like us, as opposed to people who are not like us, with different accents, different colors, different genders, different sexuality, different color skin, different football team. And that's the tribalism. The fight or flight response, we tend to greatly and vastly overreact to threats in our environment. That's why we're constantly stressed at some level. Now, in the evolutionary heritage in the savanna, it was very important for us to be on our toes, so to speak, to escape saber-toothed tigers or snakes or something like that. We had a lot of threats. We don't have nearly as many threats in this environment to our lives, but we have many micro-level aggressions from the environment around us all the time. And we tend to overreact to them with our gut reactions. People who are more intuitive, people who are more in touch with their emotions, like many of you here, tend to be more aware when these gut reactions are actually not serving them well. And you can notice that more often, not always, of course. Not when you're dealing with, Buckeyes and Michigan, like those HR professionals. Analytically minded people are much less capable of doing that. And that's a big difference and a big strength that many of you have compared to analytically minded people. That's something you need to keep in mind as you coach them. That's an awareness that you need to create, where gut reactions will be more harmful for them than they are for you. Of course, you can see these examples of gut reactions around us all the time. When we want to have that second piece of chocolate cake and we try to resist that second piece of chocolate cake, that's when we are going against our gut intuitions, our gut reactions. We want to have as much sugar as possible. That's the savanna talking. The same thing for when we want to respond to constructive critical feedback. The way that it's intuitive for us to respond is, hey, I don't want to hear this. Don't tell me this constructive critical feedback, because we feel threatened and attacked. We need to learn more healthy ways of responding to it, but that's not natural. We go against our gut intuitions. That's an example of where you want to fit into organizational culture well. Analytically minded people are going to have a harder time doing that because they're not less aware of when these gut reactions are driving them astray. So let's talk a little bit about how our mind works and what's going on there. Now, you might have heard about the subconscious and the id, superego. That's all been superseded by recent research, showing that we have, roughly speaking, two systems of thinking. The autopilot system, which is fast, habitual, automatic. It triggers in milliseconds. That's the fight or flight response. That's the tribalism. That's the accent discrimination that I mentioned before. We have another system of thinking called the intentional system, also called System 2. So the intentional system is much slower. It's much more deliberate. It's when you're noticing that those gut reactions are happening and you're choosing whether to respond to them or not. We can't control whether the gut reactions occur. We can only control our responses. The more emotionally aware and attuned you are, the more you can choose to control your response, the behaviors that you have, and the thoughts that you have in response to your gut reactions. Analytically minded people tend to be weaker at that. They're less emotionally attuned. So therefore, they will tend to react more like Spock, where they think they're reacting based on reason, but they're reacting based on emotions. And they're rationalizing their behavior. They're saying, oh, this is why I reacted this way. They're finding causes to explain their emotional behavior. There are over 100, by this count, I think over about 150 specific mental errors, like the halo and horns effect that I talked about before, that have been discovered by scholars. They're called cognitive biases. You can look them up. I talk about a lot of them in the book. So you should all have a copy of my book, as I mentioned. A lot of them are discussed in this book. The ones I just focused on, the ones that are most problematic for making good decisions in the moment, for seeing reality clearly, because this is called the Truth Seeker's Handbook. I'm writing another book for Career Press that's focused specifically on decision making in organizational context. It's a different book, but this focuses on seeing reality clearly in the moment and making good decisions. So cognitive biases impede us from doing that. You can check out Wikipedia. There's a good section on cognitive biases, describes over 150 of them. So that's another good resource. Now, what you want to do when you're speaking to your analytically minded clients is to talk about the systems of thinking, inform them about it. This is part of the skill sharing of coaching. Some coaching involves a lot of questioning. You ask a lot of useful questions, you get people to think, and that's a really important aspect of coaching. Another important aspect of coaching is skill sharing. Talking to them about emotional responses. How do you react to your emotions? How do you deal with your intuitions? And the systems of thinking approach is something that's really helpful for analytically minded clients to inform them about these different systems of thinking and help them respond more intentionally. Help them understand that their gut intuitions are not necessarily going to be correct because they're always going to be trusting whatever they feel is the right thing to do because they think it comes from their brain, whereas in reality it comes from their gut. So what you want to do is, unlike most of your other clients, you'll want to use much less stories. Analytically minded people, according to research, don't respond well to stories. It's a surprising thing. Most human beings respond really well to narratives, to stories. Analytically minded people respond quite a bit less well than you would be used to expecting with your other clients. So there are two types of things that they respond well to. Facts and statistics, especially statistics and other forms of facts, and broad picture frameworks. That's theory. So facts and theory. And we'll talk about two different types of analytically minded people who respond. One responds better to facts, another responds better to theory. But just keep in mind that these are the two best things to use to convince them. And here's where we get to the evidence. Analytically minded people will want to be convinced. They will want you to prove things to them. And that will mean that there will be less efforts and time spent on trust building and more on convincing. So as part of your relationship, as you know, the most important aspect of your interactions with a client is the quality of your relationship. That is by far what research shows for coaches as well as other helping professionals. The quality of your relationship with your coaching client is the most important thing that determines your success. You'll usually spend a lot of time building trust with a client, with warm stories and so on. With analytically minded clients, you'll want to push back more and you'll want to spend more time proving the quality of your advice to them using evidence. The kind of evidence that we discussed before. That will improve the quality of your relationship, which is, again, the most important thing for the impact of your coaching. One of the things to remember is that whatever you show to them must be convincing to them, not to you. I'm sure you know this, but it's easy to forget in the moment of a heated exchange with a client, especially an analytically minded client, where you're not getting why they're not getting it. It's important to use evidence that's convincing for them. So figure out what's convincing for them. That's why it's very valuable at the start of your coaching relationship to not simply dive deep into the issue right away, but to feel each other out, build up the relationship, and see what kind of thinker and feeler, so to speak, your client is like. The more efforts you invest into the beginning stages of the relationship, the better your relationship will be down the line when heated moments and exchanges come up, which will naturally be much more often and frequently the case with your analytically minded clients because they want to argue and debate. And before the argument and debate comes up, you want to build up that relationship and you want them to trust you. And that trust will come from you demonstrating to them with facts, research, statistics, and other evidence that you're trustworthy. Yes, Patrick, quickly.
In the general population, can you give an idea of what percentage of people are more analytical and which percentage are more relational?
It's very hard to say. Well, you probably, something maybe 40% are more analytical, but I'll have to get back to you on that. What you can easily look up is MBTI, Myers-Briggs statistics, for people who are thinking and for people who are judgment-oriented. So both of those people will tend to be analytically minded. So those will be good base rates, kind of baseline for how many people tend to be more analytical. And of course, this is all a spectrum, to be very clear. Yes?
So I've worked with Gleb before, and I work with engineers. I'm an ENFP on Myers-Briggs. And most people in my building are ISTJs. And Gleb helped me to understand why we were having problems communicating. So you mentioned in Myers-Briggs the T.
Yes, the thinking.
The thinking function, which the counterbalance for me would be feeling.
Yes.
So stories appeal to me because they're emotive. Stories, good stories always touch the emotions, right?
Yes.
But the thinking function is rational. So if until I understood this, well, let me put it in the positive sense. Understanding this helps to build trust with the individual. It's like anything else. If you're speaking their language, a language they trust, isn't that really kind of the bottom line?
It is absolutely the bottom line. It is a different method of building trust, which is kind of what we've been talking about. That's a very insightful point. It's a different method of building trust. Not building trust by stories, but building trust by facts and statistics, and by research. So again, you have theory and you have facts and statistics. And right now, then that's the way you establish trust and intimacy with the client. That's the ICF core competency. How do you establish that intimacy? How do you establish that trust? It's a different way of building trust. And I know for some of you, this will be paradigm shifting. This will blow your mind. Stories are not going to be nearly as appealing. This will feel very hard for you. I mean, seriously, this will not be intuitive. This will be hard for you to internalize. I'm telling you that right now. It's a difficult thing because you're used to stories and you're used to that mode of building trust. With analytically minded clients, it will work much less well. So if you want to really work with analytically minded clients and serve them most effectively, you will have to use a lot of facts and statistics, and you'll have to use a lot of research. And we'll talk in a little bit about the two types of analytically minded clients, the ones who prefer more research, meaning broad theory stuff, and ones who prefer more facts, on the ground things. Yes.
It seems like there's an assumption that most of us in this field are the more relational people.
Yes, that is what the research shows.
What if we are more analytical?
Great, then
How do you flip the script to?
Great. I mean, then it's going to be more intuitive for you.
That's me, but I'm just
Sure,
asking.
it's going to be more intuitive for you to use facts and research and statistics and to use more convincing.
As the coach.
Yes, it will be more intuitive for you. One of the most difficult things as a coach, as you know very well, is to adapt effectively to your client. That's something you need to do. That's something that's really important for you to do. And if you're all used to telling stories and asking questions, then your analytically minded clients will come away very annoyed. They don't like stories. They tend to perceive questions as probing and invading on their privacy. That's why if you lead with facts and statistics and research, they will trust you more and they will be more willing to open up. So that's the way you build intimacy with them. That's the way you build trust with them. Again, I'll want you to take 30 seconds and think about how you can integrate this paradigm shifting information into your coaching practice. All right, folks. Great. We'll have an opportunity for conversation a little bit, and I'm really glad that you're engaged in it. That means that your mind is a little bit blown. That's good. Okay, Patrick, I have an answer for you. About 30% of people, which I just looked up, are thinking, and that's not including the judgment. But about 30% of people come out as thinking. And so judgment, you'll also have a bunch of those who come out of judgment, which is more the planning and not spontaneous types, who'll also be more in the analytical category. So however many percentage that is. Sure. All right. Let's talk a little bit about those two types of people that I mentioned. And there are two types of analysis that we all have, that we all share. This is, again, a broad spectrum, but it's broadly the case that we either prefer a top-down analysis or a bottom-up analysis. Now, bottom-up analysis is called inductive thinking. Inductive thinking means you like to hear examples first, or you like to do things hands-on, and then you like to learn the theory behind it. The opposite is deductive thinking. You like to RTFM first, read the manual, and then I keep it clean. You like to RTFM first, and then you like to do the examples after you read the manual. So most people tend to be inductive. It's maybe about 70 to 80% of the population. But 20 to 30% tend to be deductive. So you want to figure out what type of person you're working with, the analytically minded person. Whether she's a deductive thinker, that means you want to lead with theory and research as you build up your relationship. Or an inductive thinker. That means you want to lead with facts and statistics as you build up your relationship. And you can easily notice that by seeing what the coaching client talks to you about. Does she talk about generalities, 30,000 feet, examples, vague things that seem vague to you? Or does she talk in specifics, details, what's going on the ground? And that will help you get a grasp on whether that person is more of a deductive thinker, top down, or inductive thinker, bottom up. So that's about the kind of evidence you would provide this person. And that's the ICF core competency of active listening. By active listening, you'll be able to figure out where this person fits. Now, once you are engaging with your client, one of the really useful things to do is to teach them, so analytically minded clients, specific techniques that they can use to avoid these problems. And here I'm going to turn to the book. So you should all have a book. Does anyone not have a book? So you'll want to go to page 167 in the book. This is a process called a premortem. Now we tend to, whenever problems arise and we look back on things and see why they happened, there's a process that we typically often conduct called a postmortem. What went wrong? How can we fix it? A premortem is the opposite. How can you address the problem in advance? So it's a specific technique that you can easily teach the steps to it to your analytically minded clients. I find that they love this technique because it's very analytical. It goes through the process of making a decision, launching a project, doing anything very thoroughly, and it helps them prevent the kind of problems that they have. So take a look at page 168. Now this is you can do this in teams if you're coaching a team, or if you're consulting for a team. I know I do a lot of consulting as well as coaching. I know a number of people here do consulting as well as coaching, so this is good for consulting, or if you're coaching a team, or if you're coaching with an individual. So step one, gather all the people relevant for the decision in the room. Obviously, if you're coaching one person, it would be the one person. Then next step two, explain to them all the steps relevant in doing a premortem. Step three, talk about the project, whatever they're deciding, whether it's a career move, whether they want to get a promotion, whether they're starting, whether they want to launch a new product, or whatever they want to do. Anything that they want to do, or something they're currently doing, how their business is going, and imagine it completely fails. Absolutely failed, total disaster. Then think about all the reasons why it could have failed. brainstorm all the reasons why this could have failed. And then go to step 4. Discuss all the reasons brought up, paying particular attention to ones that are rude or politically problematic. So this is really important that you want to bring up, especially in teams. Less important when you're coaching an individual, more important when you're coaching a team. There are going to be things that are politically unpopular to say. So for example, if your CEO is a nincompoop, you may not want to say that publicly. See, and the people who are working as internal coaches know what I mean. And so you want to be able to share that information anonymously. And you can have an external facilitator do that if you want to anonymize this process. Then decide on which problems are the worst problems. That's step 5, and brainstorm solutions to them. Analytically minded people love the step of brainstorming solutions to these problems. They're really great at it. And finally, integrate the solutions into the project and launch the project. The next step, part 2, I'm not going to go through it, but it's basically case studies illustrating the steps in the pre-mortem process. One case study is a mid-sized software consulting company doing an internal process of evaluation, so changing the way they evaluated their software engineers. That's one. And the second case study is helping an executive director of a mid-sized nonprofit make a decision on whether to seek a different job. So that's kind of going to be much more the case for many of you, much more of the kind of folks that you're coaching. So I want you, again, to take a pause here and to write in your handout how you can use the deductive and inductive thinking, which I mentioned just before, and the pre-mortem in your coaching practice. All right. Great, I see most of you have finished writing this. So let's go on to the next, which is a shared commitment. What you want to do is talk to your analytically minded clients about these sorts of issues at the beginning of your coaching contract. Ideally, you would put that into your coaching agreement. That's the ICF core competency of establishing the coaching agreement. Talk about how it will be your responsibility as a coach to help the analytically minded person see some potential problems that they might not be seeing in their decision-making process that might be blinding them to dangerous errors. You can even bring up Spock if this person is a Star Trek fan. So that's something it's going to be really helpful for you moving forward, because there will definitely be situations where you will run into tensions because you will be seeing things that this other person is not seeing, your client is not seeing. And if you didn't make that agreement in the beginning that you'll be pointing out these tensions, that you'll be pointing out errors that the client is committing because of their emotional reactions that are harmful for them, you'll just get into fights with your coaching client. And you don't want that. You want that to be part of the agreement going forward. So establishing that at the start is really helpful.
How would you do that? Could you get an example of how I might do that at the beginning to...
Sure. So I would talk to the client and say, hey, I'm here to provide an external perspective, kind of. So one of the things that we want to do is help me help you. And so you've probably seen many of your friends, I told the client, make mistakes, and you've seen that they're making mistakes, and they completely weren't seeing that they're making a mistake. And I'm here to do the same thing for you, to help you see it in a way where I'm totally serving your needs. And you probably didn't point out to your friends sometimes that they were making the mistakes because you didn't want a conflict with them. Well, I'll point it out to you, but as long as you don't bash me for doing so. So use situations with which they're familiar. I mean, everyone has a sort of situation where, I shouldn't have gotten married, no.
Is that sort of like a blind spot?
Yes, so we're talking all about cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are all blind spots, like the halo and horns effect. Now, again, the fact that 3 out of 100 HR professionals would hire a Michigan fan, I would call that a blind spot. We have, as I mentioned, over 150 just identified currently. There's still a lot of research. This is cutting edge stuff, and I can talk more about that. There's stuff in my book about it. So how does it work in practice? That's something that probably many of you, especially the more inductive thinkers, would like to know. How does this stuff work more in practice? I'll tell you about Samantha. Samantha was a coaching client of mine who was referred to me by an intellectual law property firm. And so this is a case actually relevant to the ethical question that we discussed before. And I did not have an agreement with the firm that I will be providing them with information. So she was just referred to me, and she paid her own way. So she was my direct client. The firm was not paying for her to be coached by me. And so we talked about the situation that she was experiencing, which was that she was at the cusp of making partner in the law firm. Now this, for those of you who haven't worked with lawyers, who don't know much about lawyers, making partner is kind of the very prestigious thing in a law firm. It's when you get to the top level, you make partner. So whenever you're hired, you're a junior or associate, after about 8 to 9 years, you have a chance of making a partner in a law firm. And this was a top law firm, really prestigious. So this was a really good thing. So she was on the cusp of making a partner. However, her work started slipping recently, and she started making more and more mistakes in the last few months. So a senior partner in the law firm referred her to me. She was uncertain about coaching. She hasn't experienced that before, but she was willing to give it a try because she trusted the senior partner's expertise and experience. So we agreed to try it for 3 sessions. So that was our coaching agreement. That's the ICF core competency of establishing coaching agreement. And I talked to her about what was happening, and she didn't seem to notice a lot of things that other people had noticed. And so that was a problem, that she wasn't seeing evidence that she was slipping. She was making mistakes that clients weren't happy about, that her colleagues weren't happy about. She was snappish to staff at the law firm, and she didn't seem to realize that. And fortunately, I had the opportunity to do a 360 analysis, which is basically it wasn't a full, formal 360 analysis. I talked to some of her colleagues and some of the staff at the firm as part of my agreement, as part of my coaching with her. And they told me that she was making these mistakes, and then I brought this information to her, so I gave her evidence. And I already knew from my conversations with her that she was a very inductive thinker. So she really wanted the details. She didn't want the broad theory. So I brought all this evidence to her, and I said, hey, you're a lawyer, do you believe yourself or do you believe all of these other people? What would a jury believe? And I spoke her language. I used the language of what would a jury believe in that sort of situation. And that was convincing to her, because she said, okay, I'm this one person, and there's all these other people who are giving evidence that is not aligned. There's clear facts that are not aligned with my beliefs. And there's a cognitive bias, one of the main cognitive biases called confirmation bias, where we tend to look for information that confirms our beliefs, and we ignore information that doesn't conform to our beliefs. So that's what was happening with her. So we talked a little bit about that, about the confirmation bias. And we talked about what she can do to address the confirmation bias in her situation. And so I mentioned already the inductive and deductive thinking, how that came into play. And here we talked about the cognitive biases and how our emotions tend to lead us astray. And we came up with a framework that was really helpful for her to address the confirmation bias, which was the vision of having 2 lawyers in her head, one arguing for one side of a point and one arguing for another side of a point. And for her to not side with any lawyers, but to be the judge, to imagine herself having that mental framework of being a judge. Again, it's something that really appealed to her, spoke her language, and was very analytical, because you analyze the arguments for one side, you analyze the arguments for the other side. I strongly encouraged her to favor the arguments against herself, against her preferred position, because of the tendency for the confirmation bias. So that was helpful for her to address the confirmation bias in the moment, but it didn't address the broader issues of what was going on with her. Why was she slipping up? And we started talking about that, what was going on. And she found the coaching helpful, so we extended the coaching agreement, which was only for the first 3 sessions. And we extended the coaching agreement, and we went on to discuss what was driving her, what was motivating her about being a lawyer, and why she found this field fascinating of intellectual law. And you know what? She was very hesitant in her answers at first. You know, she was not sure why she found this field fascinating. And so we talked about her goals, what were her long-term goals. And she didn't really have long-term goals and aspirations. So, what came out was that she, in college and in law school, she did great at law, and all her professors encouraged her to go into very prestigious law, which was intellectual law. Kind of very prestigious law, and intellectual law was very prestigious and something that she was really great at. She did not find it very fascinating, but she listened to their advice. And she went into intellectual law, and then she got this job at a top law firm, and she just kept going. Just keep going and going. And we talked about what she was passionate about, what was really driving her. So here we're getting more into the emotions. And these are, she's not used to talking about emotions. She was kind of like, should I really talk about this? This is about my career. What's up with passion? And I found that what she was doing in her off time, she was spending a lot of time working for and volunteering on the board of a local environmental nonprofit. And she was devoting a lot of her salary to it. And I asked her, hey, why did you choose not to pursue environmental law? And she said, well, that is not very prestigious at all. If I pursued that, then, people would not be looking up at me. People would not be, she was using different terms, but I'm kind of paraphrasing. She basically, what happened was that the desire to please other people, to please her professors, to please her colleagues, to achieve the status, so to speak, drove her into intellectual law rather than the career of her passion. And so we discussed the situation, and we, after a lot of thinking, she thought that, she realized that what was happening, why she was slipping up, why she was making these errors, is because that she was kind of self-sabotaging. She didn't want to become a partner. If she became a partner, that would be her course for life. She would just be set. And her autopilot system was sabotaging her, impeding her ability to do her work. And so that's what was happening, and was very tragic in a way when she made that realization. And so we talked about what she should do. And she had plenty of money from her intellectual law career for the previous 7 or 8 years. And she decided that, maybe she should switch jobs. Maybe she should go into environmental law, because pursue her passion. And we conducted a pre-mortem on this, so using the technique of the pre-mortem, this is where it was quite useful, someone deciding whether to switch careers. And she thought that, hey, that she wouldn't have too many problems switching into this, because she had good network, but more importantly, she had the passion, the driving passion to really do this. And so she left the firm, and she got hired at the nonprofit where she was a board member. And now she works there. She's quite happy. The intellectual law firm wasn't quite happy with me for that. But I talked to the senior partner. I explained to him that would he really want a partner who's not fully committed? It was ambiguous, but he understood the point that I was making. So that's an example of where you use a lot of these techniques in a specific situation. Yes. This is the time for questions before we will go to a group discussion.
So in that example that you gave, how did you get her to recognize what her passions were?
I asked her about what she was doing in her off time, how she was spending her time. Basically, the way we do our activities, the way we spend our time, often indicates our passion. Do we spend our time online looking at Thailand vacations? Well, maybe we want to go to Thailand. Do we spend time, watching some kind of movies or something like that? Well, maybe that indicates that we have a passion about that.
So you focus on time spent as opposed to what do you like?
Yeah, questions like what do you like usually tend to bring up what do my law professors tell me I should like. That's kind of the equivalent. That gets mixed up, especially for analytically minded people who are not as much in touch with their emotions as some other people are, as people who are more emotionally oriented. It tends to bring up things around, my gut reaction tells me to do this, whereas in reality it's other people have told me to do this and I internalize this as something I should do in my life, and I will have burnout and buy a bike and go be a bike chain girl in 5 years. Whatever.
So once trust has been established with the analytical-minded person through research theory, do you have to keep proving it to them once trust, or can you slack up?
Once trust is established, you'll often be able to continue. However, where you'll have difficulty and where you'll want to bring it back is if you're dealing with a point that is at contrast with their gut intuitions. So you'll want to bring research back in at that point, and you'll want to be prepared. If you anticipate a challenging conversation, what you'll want to do is prepare for that conversation by looking at either some facts and statistics, if this is an intuitive, a deductive-minded person, or some research and theory, if this is a deductive-minded person. Ideally both, but more of the facts and statistics if you're dealing with inductive, more of the theory if you're dealing with deductive.
In my coaching program, they mentioned that intuition is always right. So it was really intuition-based. Therefore, you want to pull out of the client, what does your gut say? But I think it's just you're using different words, like not to trust their gut. What's really going on? It's like they're not trusting their intuition, and maybe they're trusting their ego, right?
I think it depends on the terminology used. So I'm specifically using gut reaction to refer in the way that it's used in behavioral science research, which may not be the way it's used in your program. Totally fine. In behavioral science research, it's usually used to refer to primal instincts and reactions that date back to the savannah. So, we don't want to trust your gut about how much food you should eat, right? That's not a good way of trusting your gut. You don't want to trust your gut about which person you trust based on their accent. Not good things to trust their gut. You don't want to, HR people in the room will tell you that you don't want to use a qualitative interview as a way of evaluating potential job applicants, because qualitative interviews have been shown to be not very good because some people are good at doing interviews and you make connection with them, but they're not actually good at the job.
So in other words, instead of just using the word intuition with them, you really just want to use the words, what are you feeling, your emotions, your thoughts, your your passions.
Yes, what are your values, your passions. Again, you will sometimes get the kind of answer where they will tell you, I'm passionate about intellectual law, whereas in reality, they were told they should be passionate about intellectual law, and you will get that. So it's a good thing to do would be to focus on how they spend their time. How do you spend your time? What do you do in your free time? Do you play a lot of soccer, for example? That's a good indicator that there's some kind of thing that's unfulfilled there. If they do, yes. So focusing on their specific observable behaviors is quite helpful. All right, I'm giving you all a hand. Excellent discussion. Anyone wants to report briefly about the outcomes of your discussion?
One thing that wasn't mentioned is what if the coach is analytical?
Great. I think someone did mention. Great. Then it makes it easier for the coach to relate to analytically minded people, and by comparison, harder to relate to more emotionally oriented people. So coaches who are more analytically minded have to learn how to use more storytelling in order to relate to people who are not analytically minded. Yes, one more, last person.
Sure. I love the idea of the inductive versus deductive. And considering that, because sometimes I've found that I may be wasting some time with people because I approach them the wrong way.
Yeah.
Now I have some language and some terminology to help me think about them a little bit differently, so I appreciate that.
I'm very glad to hear that. Glad to talk. Yes, Taylor.
Well, very one quick thing is
Sure.
a lot of times people talk about emotions, but they don't name them. So they say, oh, I did this, and this. And as a coach, if you say, so you were angry, if you can name the emotion with people like that, it helps them
Yeah.
to understand it. It's an emotional response. So you were discouraged, so you were upset, or whatever, you had fear, whatever. Use language to name the emotion.
Yes, Eli is completing a PhD, and so this is an actual research based. So I know the research behind this, and he knows the research behind this. There is research showing that if you name an emotion for someone, it helps them manage the emotion more effectively. So that is actually a good research-based strategy. Yes.
Do you have a suggestion for someone like myself who is not analytical, even though I work with analyticals? If I'm coaching, how, and I understand that going into the relationship, how do I go about finding sufficient evidence or data to support what I'm trying to show?
That's a great question. I would suggest looking to their colleagues and asking for evidence the way I did with Samantha's colleagues. So do a 360. I know you presented on that. I was there in the presentation. Doing a 360, looking at their colleagues, looking at evidence of what you want to find, as well as looking for evidence that might disconfirm your theories. So saying, I believe this, but maybe it's not true. Let me look for evidence of that. Because you don't want to be surprised when your coaching client brings up that evidence if you didn't find it before. So look for evidence from colleagues around that person, I would suggest. Great. Okay, so I mentioned that this presentation is based on a 12 credits CCE approved self-paced online course, Coaching the Analytical Mind. I created this together with 6 self-paced modules with readings and videos and 2 seminars. That's what this course is about. This is a very, very nutshell, brief version of it. Very deductive oriented with a couple of stories. Now, let's talk a little bit about the money. Always a good question in coaching. I want to ask you, do you want to take your clients from this to this? That's going to be the goal. How do you relate to your analytically minded clients? The regular fee for the course is $1,200. Standard $100 per CCE. We have the launch phase right now. That's $900 instead of $1,200 for the next 3 months in return for your commitment to leave a testimonial and refer 3 fellow coaches. And just today for ICF members only, just today, it's going to be a $300 deduction to $600. So if you want that, please turn to the back, very back of your handout. And you will see the form to fill out with your information. And I'll give you a minute to fill that out. Let's go on to the ending of the story. I want you to think about how you can figure out and address the challenges of analytically minded people. How can you address their emotions? That's a key part of this presentation. This is key for you to be able to take away this information, to help them recognize when emotional drivers lead them astray and to meet them where they are, deductive or inductive. Again, another fundamental part of this presentation, how can you meet them where they are, not where you would like them to be, but where they are right now. Prove your points using evidence that the analytically minded people can connect with. That's a key part of this presentation, a key part of what I want you to take away, and establish shared commitment by building shared understanding. That's another key part of what I want you to come away with. Now, I want you to think about keeping calm and remembering these key points as you go forward. And then in conclusion, I want you to think about what's your story? What do you want your story to be? You came here, you heard a paradigm shifting presentation, blew your mind a little bit. Do you want to just let it go? Do you want to just let it slip away when you come out of this room? Is that the kind of coach you want to be? Or do you want to be the kind of coach who hears a paradigm shifting presentation, who says, I'm going to integrate this into my coaching practice? Where do you want to be a year from now? I think you can all be the kind of coaches who help your clients be the best they can be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Very, very interesting.